Let's see if I can get this thing together. This is about my third attempt at the video, and either I move out of frame or I fail to turn the video camera on, or some other event happens and I get nowhere. Let's see if we can get this on there. So that sits over the boss like that. Now I've got to hold those two pieces together. I usually do that with another pair of tweezers. Flip it over, and the spring, which is currently hiding right there, I have to lift that up and hook it around that arm. Now that's all together. That's one piece. That's as it should go back into the shutter. These tweezers that I just used are these ones. Very, very pointy. Came from the People's Republic of China, like everything we buy these days. Vitas by Pequin, Switzerland standard it says. They are stainless steel, they are very sharp and they're very good. The only danger with them is that you accidentally stick them in your arm and they'll poke out the other side because they're that sharp. On the subject of tweezers, these were the tweezers I've been using for a few years. They were getting very tired. I decided I needed to replace them. So I had a look on eBay and I saw these ones. Yeah, they look like basically the same thing, except when you get to them in real life. I'll zoom you in a bit. You can see they're flat. There's no relief on these. There doesn't need to be any relief. They're as thin as buggery. You'll also notice that the tips aren't shaped in any useful way. They're full thickness all the way down. They're not sharp. They don't meet well. And another nice, well, there's no nice way to say it, they're utter crap. So if you're looking for a set of cheap good screwdrivers, it'll be something like this. If you're looking to get something cheaper which is absolute rubbish, it's probably something like this. So the lesson there is quite simple. Buyer beware when you're buying stuff off eBay. These are just rubbish. I mean, they could be cardboard cutouts for tweezers for all the good they'll ever do me. Of course, I was most disappointed by that, because really what I wanted was a replacement for my existing pointy tweezers that was moderately priced and would work well. But in the end, I bit the bullet and went for these, which were certainly more expensive, but they're a bit pointy for me. I think I've done as much as I can of reshaping the tips on these particular tweezers to get them to bite nicely. Basically, they're just worn out around those tips. Everything's much too rounded off where it needs to be flat, too flat where it should be rounded off. They're probably somewhat shorter than they began their life too. So that's the joy of tweezers, which was just a little aside really. This piece here is back together and ready to go in the shutter. Okay, this little lever I've just been reassembling. I'm just going to wipe some molybdenum paste over the catch on the end where that has to effectively latch and unlatch from the mechanism, and I'll get that over its post, hopefully without disturbing anything. Now the timing of this cam is quite critical. I'm just checking the arrangement there. When this arm is back against this stop, that arm should move freely past the side of that cam. No interference. And as I swing that backwards and forwards, you can hear that flash contact moving. That's good. Nothing is conflicting there. That all moves smoothly. Now I've got to get its spring in position. So with this arm blocking the movement of that, this latch blocking the movement of that arm, I can hook the spring in, stretch it out and hook it over this post. So that's effectively armed, if you like, or cocked, that flash sync mechanism. And I can put the cover and so forth back in place. So to continue with the shutter, we have two little brass standoffs. Go there and there. This piece, this cover needs to go in. As previously mentioned, there are two shafts that come up through this. This tab hooks into the frame just over here. Get that tab in place first, then get this over the shaft there, and at that end you got to watch out for this spring that you don't displace it. This arm must be over that side where it's free to move. The plain screw goes at this end. At the other end, we've got our flash sync switch, if you like, or lever. I usually slide that in underneath the spring. Take the screw. This screw's got a shoulder on it that lever runs around. Position that. Run that screw down. Make sure that that lever can swing freely around it. Do that up tight, and the spring needs to run against this boss. So if I can pick it up with my tweezers and lift it over into place. Nope, it just popped off and flew away. Now I've got to try and get it back into position. The spring, the tail of the spring comes up against that little brass post. Let's have another go. Nope, it's not my day today. This spring is obviously a little bit out of shape perhaps. Try for the third time. That's it. It's got quite a strong detent on that spring. Okay, that's good. Now the B lever needs to go into place. The B lever's job, of course, is to hold the shutter in the blade's open position while you have your finger on the shutter release button until such stage as you release it and set it free. And the B lever goes on here, and then we've got that screw that had the spring around the top. It holds that in position. Now the spring at the moment is off there, so I'm going to put the screw on by itself. and set the spring in position. I've got to get that spring seated around the groove in the head of that screw without it disappearing across the room. Okay, so it's around the screw, but this needs to come around there. That's around that end of the arm. This piece of spring here needs to come to the inside there. So I've got to pick it up with my tweezers, bring it to the inside. That means that the B lever is now sprung loaded and swings neatly into position. Okay, things are going along quite well now. The release lever. The spring on the release lever needs to be tucked down into the case. It goes down at an angle, and then the release lever sits on that post. No, that mucked it up. Like that. And the spring is tucked down here in the case so that the green lever doesn't hit it. That's why it's such a weird shape. It's almost like it was an afterthought of how they were going to put their return spring on their shutter release lever. It's not a tidy result at all. The main lever. This I need to clean. It's covered in graphite grease probably, but all the graphite grease is just covering everything really. Most of these surfaces don't come in contact with anything, they're just floating in the air, but they're just smothered in grease. Well, that grease of course will find its way anywhere and everywhere, not necessarily places where it's useful. So I'm just cleaning all that off. Looking at the state of this main lever's in very good condition. It looks very tidy. Of course the whole camera looked quite tidy, it's probably done very little work. Where's my shutter? I'm going to apply some molybdenum paste to the lever here that operates the pallets, to this lever where the main lever picks up on that, on this catch which holds the shutter in the cocked position, here and here, and that'll probably get me by. The main lever, I'm going to run the molybdenum paste around the inside circumference, around the outside circumference, and this is called the bird paw. The bird paw looks like vaguely like a bird. So at the beak I'm putting some on there, and at the tail here I'm just putting a wipe on there. That should be sufficient. This can go on the shutter. I'm drowning in tweezers here at the moment. I've got every pair of tweezers I've ever owned on the table. So first I cocked that mechanism by swinging that arm across. Let's get the spring down in the body in that groove. Hold back the pallet lever, swing this lever back out of the way to allow the arm to, the main lever to drop in. Check that this is free, and the spring on the main lever needs to be hooked over its post. Its post is there. And get that lever tucked down. Looking good. Now this spring here needs to come onto the back of this. I'll swing that across and get it in place. I'm going to zoom you in so you can see those springs. That'll do. So we've got this fine spring from here hooked into the back of this arm. Our spring on the main lever is this coil spring visible down here, hooked over that post. The one next to it was the spring on the arm of the flash sink stuff. Well, that looks like it's all good. It's all together. If I clean up the shutter speed settings cam plate here, we can put that back on the camera of the shutter and see how it works. Right, with all the old grease and associated dust and dirt removed, I'm going to wipe around the inside circumference. That's where it runs around the lens tube. Around the cam surfaces where it revolves over the pin on the retard gear train that swings the arm in and out. And where the high-speed spring gets compressed in here, that's the 500th of a second spring, so I want to wipe some on that surface, and on some of that surface wouldn't hurt. Now, with my shutter complete, I should be able to swing this into position. Now the B lever gets trapped underneath. You have to fish that out so it's not trapped and it's running on that cam surface. That's looking good. Now this should give us B if I cock it. That sounded snappy. This should give us 1 second. That certainly ran smoothly. And a tenth should be somewhere about here. That sounded credible too. So that's all looking very good. I've got my front cover here. I'll give that a quick wipe and that can go on the shutter. And then I'll take it away and test that on my shutter speed tester. To be quite honest, I think that sounded pretty good to me. The speeds are likely to be somewhat slow at the highest speed. They probably always were. But that aside, it's probably quite good. The highest shutter speed on a camera was one of those numbers, like the number of jewels in a watch or the number of valves in a radio. It was taken as a measure of the quality of the item. It really had very little bearing on the subject as to whether or not the item was good, better or best. I'll go and test this. Shutter speeds are good. Particularly good between the 10th and the 25th settings. Now that's like a critical area. If the shutter speed adjustments are well out, you can find that speeds will display as much the same, or I think you can even get them reversed in some cases. Right, so I've got my wire in there. I put my plastic insulating slug in there. I've got the tiny screw that clamps my flash wire in place. And if I can get my screwdriver onto that without it coming adrift with a magnetic screwdriver, no, that's good. That's okay. Now the curved rack, this is what pushes the lever on the side of the shutter and cocks it. I'm just giving that a wipe with molybdenum paste on the inside, top and bottom surfaces. The outside surface runs on the teeth of the gear on the front. I'll get this swung into place and I can get that on the back of the shutter. If I rotate it into position, I can see the two screw holes. That's the small screw head with the flange. This is the small countersunk head screw. It's a very shallow screw. Last piece here is this, the detents for our apertures. So the spacing is wider at the large apertures, close together at the small apertures. I'll slide this into position and spring the other end in position and check that I've got detent. Yep, that clicks positively into position. That's good. So that shutter is done, and that can be put aside while I clean the lenses. This front lens group came with a UV filter on it. In this case it's a Kenko filter, very thin mount as you can see, just made just ideal for this sort of job. Kodak had ones too which were on a fine mount, meant you could close the front of the camera. Okay, so I'll clean these glass surfaces. I'll start with the outside, which is quite clean because it's been underneath that UV filter. And I'm just using domestic glass cleaner here. And I just want to get this front surface free from any dust particles, smears, haze, anything of that nature, because it makes it easier to judge how well I've got this internal surface clean. The internal surface is heavily concave. It's difficult to judge by reflections or whatever exactly how clean you've got this. It's much easier if I can look in from the other side. I can see there's quite a bit of haze on this lens because it immediately changes appearance as soon as I put that wet cotton bud on there. Now the secret will be whether that haze is gone as a result of my cleaning. So I've got to hold this up at different angles and I'm looking through the glass to see if I can see anything on that surface. And to be quite honest, that looks very good to me. So I think that's good. And that I'll put on the shutter now. There's our spacing, our ring. It's a trim ring. It doesn't determine the height of the lens at all. The lens stops on the lens tube. It screws in until it's hard against the lens tube. That trim ring is not under any tension from the lens. That's quite tight to screw in. That's okay. That looks very good. So the rear group. Now this looks much worse. So I'm hopeful that the haze on the internal surface will clean off. And I don't know until now whether it will or not. It certainly looks hopeful. It's showing much the same effects as that front group did, which probably means that that haze was like an oil haze from the shutter. And the rearmost group, I'm just going to screw this into the shutter as big as it gives me somewhere to work from as anything else. That certainly cleaned a lot of the haze, but I can still see haze. I don't know how much of that's on the external surface here or what's on the other side of this external lens element, because there's certainly scope for that to be hazy on the inside. Beyond that we have one more cleanable surface, and then the only other surface in there is the cement layer, and of course we can do nothing with it. That looks very good. What it means is that the majority of the haze was on this external surface. Which means that I don't have to open this up to clean an internal surface, which is a bonus because it's very difficult to get things clean, absolutely smear free and free from all dust and stuff. So if there's no dirt, don't be cleaning things. It's not going to do you any good. That's good. That's a good result. I'll give this front surface one more clean, and I'm going to put its UV filter on the front there. Just to make sure I got everything, particularly around the edges. That's good. Now I'll clean the filter and put that in place. With a big fingerprint on the outside. It's very difficult to get a thing like this entirely smear free because often there is contaminants have got down in the edge between the glass and the frame. And of course once you get in here and you start wiping at it, you start bringing those contaminants out from the corners they were comfortably hiding in. I'll clean this outside surface with its fingerprint. I'm rolling this cotton bud as I go to keep presenting a fresh cotton surface to the glass as much as possible, which is particularly useful at avoiding picking up some fragment of dust or grit and grinding it into the lens. It's also useful for not transferring some oily haze from one part of the glass to another. I'm looking at the state of this filter and I can see a tiny mark right here. Now I'm just running a toothpick over it. I can tell that that's a chip. That's a chip in the glass, so you could spend from now until eternity trying to wipe that mark away. It's not going to mark, it's not going to run away. There's our shutter and lens assembly, all clean, ready to go back on the camera. And so I'll put that to one side. I've got to clean up that camera body and start putting things back together.